Listen, Westerns. 1 minute ago, Iranian military forces landed secretly on African soil, 1,200 troops, advanced weapons. We invited them without asking your permission. 54 African nations coordinated this operation while your intelligence slept. Your satellites photographed everything, but your analysts saw nothing. We're armed, unified, and coming for you. Let me tell you what actually happened. Your intelligence failed catastrophically, not because collection systems malfunctioned, but because analytical assumptions prevented correct interpretation of information your systems collected abundantly. American satellites photographed increased activity at Iranian military bases during December 2025, showing troop concentrations, equipment movements, and logistics preparations. National Security Agency intercepted communications between Iranian Revolutionary Guard commands and unidentified African contacts discussing operational timelines, deployment requirements, and coordination procedures. CIA human sources in Tehran reported Revolutionary Guard units receiving specialized training in tropical environments, in desert warfare, and in asymmetric operations. Every indicator existed in your intelligence databases for weeks before deployment occurred. Your analysts dismissed every indicator because assumptions about Iranian capabilities and African coordination prevented recognizing that preparations were operational rather than aspirational, that coordination was genuine rather than wishful thinking, and that deployment would actually occur rather than remaining theoretical possibility that pressure would prevent. Analysts assumed Iranian military lacked expeditionary capabilities for sustained operations 5,000 miles from home because previous Iranian operations remained regional. Analysts assumed African nations lacked coordination for major military cooperation because previous coordination attempts failed through national rivalries and external pressure. Analysts assumed that even if deployment was planned, diplomatic warnings and threatened consequences would deter execution because rational actors avoid actions triggering overwhelming retaliation. Every assumption was catastrophically wrong because you confused past patterns with permanent limitations, because you underestimated Iranian determination and African coordination, and because you overestimated your own deterrence credibility after years of issuing threats that enforcement proved empty. The Iranian military developed expeditionary capabilities specifically for this deployment through Russian training, through Chinese logistics support, and through operational experience that Syrian and Iraqi operations provided, showing that Revolutionary Guard forces can operate effectively in foreign territories with minimal infrastructure when properly supported. African coordination succeeded because I spent 38 months building institutional mechanisms through Continental Defense Alliance, because shared anti-Western sentiment created a common purpose stronger than historical rivalries, and because external support from Russia, China, and Iran provided resources that previous coordination lacked, making cooperation sustainable rather than temporary. And your deterrence failed because I calculated correctly that you wouldn't enforce threats when enforcement triggers costs exceeding benefits, when domestic politics prevent sustained military operations for objectives that voters don't understand, and when alliance cohesion fractures over supporting American preferences that European interests contradict. Your red line about Iranian military deployment to Africa was a psychological operation attempting to prevent action through threatened consequences that you hoped I would believe were credible. I called your bluff by proceeding with deployment, by coordinating openly with Iran, and by daring you to implement consequences that your threats promised, but your capabilities cannot deliver without triggering catastrophic escalation. The 1,200 Iranian troops that arrived over past 18 hours represent force composition designed specifically for multiple missions, including defending against potential Western military strikes, training African forces in asymmetric warfare and advanced weapons systems, establishing intelligence fusion capabilities for monitoring Western activities, and demonstrating Iranian commitment to anti-Western resistance that decades of pressure couldn't break. Force includes 4,000 combat infantry from Revolutionary Guard ground forces that Syrian urban warfare hardened, 2,000 missile specialists operating Fateh 110 and Zulfagar systems with ranges reaching every Western installation in West and Central Africa, 1,500 air defense operators deploying Bavar 373 systems that Iranian claims match Russian S-300 performance, 1,000 electronic warfare technicians carrying jamming equipment that Syrian operations proved effective against Western precision weapons, 1,000 intelligence personnel establishing fusion center integrating Iranian and African collection, 800 special operations forces trained for sabotage and assassination if conflicts escalate, 700 cyber warfare specialists targeting Western networks, and remaining support personnel providing logistics, medical, and communications functions. Combat infantry provides conventional defensive capability protecting Iranian presence against potential Western ground operations, provides training cadre for African forces learning modern infantry tactics, and provides psychological deterrence through demonstrating that attacking Iranian positions requires ground combat that Western publics oppose after Afghanistan and Iraq experiences. These aren't ceremonial troops making symbolic gestures. These are combat veterans who fought in Aleppo, who held positions against ISIS in Iraq, who conducted operations in Yemen supporting Houthi forces, and who possess experience that most Western forces lack because your militaries haven't fought peer opponents in decades while Iranian forces face Turkish, Israeli, American armed, and Saudi adversaries using modern weapons. Missile specialists bring weapon systems that fundamentally alter regional military balance by providing strike capabilities that previously didn't exist in sub-Saharan Africa, by threatening Western installations that operated with impunity, and by creating deterrence through threatening retaliation against any Western strikes on Iranian or African positions. Fateh 110 missiles with 300-kilometer range can strike French military bases in Ivory Coast, Senegal, and Chad from Burkina Faso positions. Zolfaghar missiles with 700-kilometer range can reach American installations in Ghana, can threaten Mediterranean shipping from Sahel positions, and can strike targets throughout West Africa from centralized launch positions. Your analysts will dismiss Iranian missiles as primitive compared to Western precision weapons, as inaccurate compared to GPS-guided systems, as vulnerable compared to hardened launchers. Dismissals are technically correct but strategically irrelevant because precision doesn't matter when targeting large installations, because volume compensates for accuracy through saturation attacks, and because mobility prevents targeting when launchers relocate after firing. The strategic impact comes not from technical sophistication but from psychological effect of vulnerability that Western forces never experienced in Africa, from operational constraints that commanders face when planning strikes knowing that Iranian retaliation could kill their personnel, and from political complications when attacks trigger casualties that domestic populations question were worth whatever objectives motivated strikes. Every Western-based commander in the region now calculates that operations against Iranian or African positions might trigger missile strikes against their facilities, that force protection requires defensive measures that divert resources from offensive operations, and that risk assessments must account for Iranian retaliation that previous planning ignored because threats didn't exist. The psychological shift from operating with impunity to operating under threat changes everything regardless of whether Iranian missiles ever launch, because threat alone constrains freedom of action that Western dominance depended on. Air defense operators deploying Bavar 373 systems create an integrated defense network that contests Western air superiority for the first time in sub-Saharan Africa since decolonization, that forces Western air forces to conduct suppression operations before striking protected targets, and that risks aircraft losses that domestic politics make unacceptable for limited operations. Bavar 373 that Iran developed after decades of sanctions preventing Russian S-300 imports supposedly matches S-300 performance through reverse engineering, through indigenous innovation, and through testing against actual threats rather than just simulations. Whether Iranian claims about performance are accurate is less important than the fact that the system exists, that operators are trained, that integration with African radar networks provides coverage gaps that individual systems alone couldn't achieve, and that Western pilots must assume capable defenses rather than plan missions assuming air supremacy. Your air forces that dominated African airspace for 75 years through technological superiority, through sophisticated training, through overwhelming numbers, and through operating against adversaries who lacked effective air defenses, now face environments requiring suppression campaigns, requiring larger force packages, requiring accepting risks that limited operations might not justify, and requiring extended operations that domestic support might not sustain. The shift from air dominance to contested airspace is psychological as much as military, because pilots who expected unopposed operations now face potential losses, because commanders who planned strikes assuming success now must account for failures, and because political leaders who authorized operations assuming minimal risks now face questions about whether objectives justify casualties that air defense effectiveness could inflict. Electronic warfare capabilities that Iranian technicians bring target the network-centric warfare that American military transformation centered on, that NATO operations depend on for coordinating distributed forces, and that precision weapons require for GPS guidance, for communication links, and for sensor fusion. Russian-provided Krasuka-4 systems that Iranian forces operate jam satellite communications that NATO relies on, spoof GPS signals that precision weapons depend on, and disrupt radar that air defenses use, creating electronic environment where Western technological advantages erode when communications fail, when weapons miss targets, and when sensors provide false information. Chinese jamming equipment adds capabilities in different frequency ranges. Iranian indigenous systems contribute capabilities that sanctions force them to develop, and African operators who Russian advisors train provide local knowledge about Western systems deployed in region. The electronic warfare campaign doesn't need to completely suppress Western systems to achieve strategic effects because degraded effectiveness is sufficient when it forces commanders to operate with uncertainty, when it reduces precision weapons effectiveness enough that strikes require more munitions, when it creates doubt about sensor information that targeting depends on, and when it demonstrates that Western technological superiority is contestable through asymmetric means that adversaries possessing sophisticated electronics can employ. Your forces that planned operations assuming perfect communications, assuming accurate GPS, assuming reliable sensors now must plan for degraded capabilities, must account for electronic attack that previous African operations never faced, and must accept reduced effectiveness that lengthens operations beyond what limited interventions can sustain politically. Intelligence personnel establishing Fusion Center in Ouagadougou create continental collection and analysis capability that integrates Iranian intelligence from decades of operations against Western targets, that incorporates African collection from hosting Western forces who Operation Security assumed African services were too primitive to threaten, and that benefits from Russian and Chinese intelligence sharing, providing technical capabilities and analytic expertise that amplify African and Iranian strengths. Fusion Center employs 2,000 personnel, including Iranian intelligence officers whose Syrian and Iraqi operations trained in collection against Western forces, African intelligence officers from 54 nations who Russian training upgraded, and technical specialists who Chinese equipment enables for signals intelligence collection, cyber operations, and technical surveillance that Western forces operating in Africa never expected facing. The center's mission is comprehensive intelligence warfare, including collecting against Western military operations to provide warning of potential strikes, conducting counterintelligence to identify and eliminate Western intelligence networks that penetrated African governments, supporting information operations through providing intelligence enabling propaganda showing Western interference, and coordinating offensive operations including cyber attacks, sabotage, and if necessary assassination operations against Western personnel whose activities threaten Iranian or African interests. Iranian intelligence experience conducting operations against Israel, against American forces in Iraq, against Saudi targets, and against Western assets globally transfers to African operations where targets are less protected, where operational security is less sophisticated, and where decades of Western complacency created vulnerabilities that determined adversaries can exploit. Your intelligence networks in Africa that operated for 75 years with minimal interference, that recruited assets throughout African governments, that conducted operations assuming African counterintelligence was too limited to threaten sophisticated operations, and that provided intelligence advantage enabling you to shape policies, prevent challenges, and maintain dominance now face systematic destruction through coordinated counterintelligence that Iranian experience enables, that Russian training provided, that Chinese technical systems support, and that Fusion Center coordinates across 54 nations simultaneously. Every CIA station chief in Africa now operates under surveillance that Fusion Center coordinates. Every recruited asset faces identification through methods that Iranian counterintelligence teaches. Every operational method faces exposure through analysis that Fusion Center conducts correlating activities across multiple countries to identify patterns that individual services miss. Special operations forces that deployment includes provide capabilities for surgical strikes, for sabotage operations, for assassination if conflicts escalate to levels requiring targeted killings, and for training African special operations units in techniques that Iranian Quds Force refined through decades of covert operations. These aren't conventional infantry operating openly. These are elite operators trained for missions in hostile territories, for operations without official acknowledgement, for creating plausible deniability that governments require when conducting operations that international law prohibits. Iranian special operations experience includes assassinations in Europe and Middle East targeting regime opponents, includes supporting proxy forces in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, includes sabotage operations against adversary facilities, and includes sophisticated tradecraft that Israeli, American, and European counterterrorism prove difficult to defeat despite massive intelligence capabilities. The presence of 800 Iranian special operators in Africa creates capability for retaliation against Western intelligence officers whose activities threaten Iranian or African interests, creates option for sabotage against Western facilities if conflicts escalate, creates training capacity for African special operations who learn techniques that conventional military forces don't teach, and creates psychological deterrence through threatening that Western covert operations face reciprocal responses that your officers never anticipated when operating in Africa, where host nations supposedly lacked capability or will to retaliate against Western intelligence activities. Your intelligence officers who operated with impunity now face potential targeted killings. your facilities face potential sabotage, and your operations face potential exposure that Iranian special operations capabilities enable when Fusion Center identifies targets and when political authorization directs action. Cyber warfare specialists deploying advanced capabilities target Western networks, including military communications, intelligence systems, critical infrastructure, and commercial networks whose disruption creates economic damage, creates political pressure, and demonstrates that Western technological dominance is vulnerable to sophisticated cyber operations. Iranian cyber capabilities that developed under sanctions include offensive tools for disrupting adversary networks, defensive capabilities for protecting Iranian systems, and intelligence capabilities for penetrating target networks to exfiltrate information. Chinese cyber support provides tools that Chinese offensive operations developed, provides training that Chinese military cyber units conduct, provides intelligence about Western network vulnerabilities that Chinese penetrations discovered, and provides coordination ensuring that African and Iranian operations don't conflict while maximizing combined effects. Russian cyber expertise contributes capabilities that APT-28 and APT-29 operations demonstrated, including sophisticated malware, including persistent network access, including social engineering techniques, and including operational security that prevents attribution or enables false flag operations, blaming attacks on other actors. The combined Iranian, Chinese, Russian, and African cyber capabilities that specialists in Burkina Faso now coordinate create cyber warfare capacity that Western forces in Africa never anticipated facing, that critical infrastructure protecting Western facilities assumes doesn't exist, and that commercial networks that Western companies operate assume are secure because African cyber capabilities were supposedly primitive. Your assumptions are about to be tested when cyber operations begin targeting your networks, when systems fail in ways that investigations cannot clearly attribute, and when damage accumulates demonstrating that cyber domain is contested rather than dominated by Western technological superiority. Support personnel providing logistics, medical, and communications functions enable sustained operations that temporary deployments couldn't achieve, enable force protection that hostile environments require, enable coordination with Iranian command that operations require, and enable expansion if additional forces deploy. Logistics specialists establish supply chains connecting Iranian production to African deployment through sea routes transiting Suez Canal, through air routes using Russian cargo aircraft, through land routes crossing friendly territories, and through pre-positioned stocks that Iranian advanced deployment established. Medical capabilities enable treating casualties from potential combat, treating illness from tropical environments, and providing health services that remote deployment locations require. Communications specialists establish secure links that quantum encryption protects, that Chinese satellites carry, that redundant systems back up, and that your signals intelligence cannot intercept or decrypt despite capabilities that global communication surveillance requires. The comprehensive force package that Iranian deployment provides is designed for sustained presence rather than temporary deployment, is structured for multiple contingencies rather than single mission, is supported by infrastructure enabling indefinite operations, and is protected by capabilities making Western military action prohibitively costly despite your overwhelming conventional superiority. Every aspect of deployment demonstrates planning depth that temporary measures don't require, demonstrates resource commitment that symbolic gestures don't justify, and demonstrates determination that your threats about consequences didn't deter because I calculated correctly, that you value avoiding catastrophic escalation more than you value preventing Iranian presence that poses zero direct threat to Western territories or populations. Your intelligence agencies are briefing leadership right now about deployment details that public announcement forces acknowledging, about capabilities that force composition reveals, about implications that extend far beyond bilateral Iranian-African cooperation to question entire Western security architecture. Your National Security Council is convening emergency sessions, debating response options including military strikes destroying Iranian forces before they establish defensive positions, diplomatic protests demanding immediate withdrawal, economic sanctions punishing nations supporting deployment, covert operations sabotaging Iranian logistics, or acceptance that deployment succeeded and that preventing future deployments requires different strategies than threats that failed preventing this one. Every option faces fatal flaws because I designed deployment specifically to make military response trigger catastrophic costs, to make diplomatic protests appear ineffective when compliance is refused, to make economic sanctions harm sanctioners more than targets, to make covert operations face counterintelligence that defeats sophisticated penetrations, and to make acceptance appear as strategic defeat, requiring explanations about why red lines weren't enforced and threats proved empty. Military strikes trigger Continental Defense Treaty obligations requiring 54 nations to treat attacks on Iranian forces in African territory as attacks on Africa, demanding collective response, including military deployments to Iran defending against American strikes, resource export restrictions eliminating cobalt and rare earth supplies your industries need, Western asset seizures confiscating investments worth hundreds of billions, and intelligence operations exposing and eliminating your networks across continent. Diplomatic protests demanding withdrawal face my refusal based on sovereign right to invite foreign forces regardless of whether you approve, face Iranian refusal to withdraw when deployment serves their strategic interests, face African support through continental alliance that makes isolated pressure impossible, and face international law that permits defensive military cooperation while prohibiting interference in sovereign decisions about foreign military presence. Your protests will be noted, will be rejected, will be ignored, and will demonstrate that diplomatic tools are ineffective when targets possess alternatives, making your approval unnecessary, when coordination provides collective defense against pressure, and when determination to assert sovereignty exceeds concern about Western disapproval. Economic sanctions attempting to punish deployment face immediate African retaliation through resource restrictions that I've threatened explicitly, face Chinese trade providing alternative markets that sanctions cannot affect, face European reluctance when supporting American-Iranian obsessions costs African relationships that migration management requires, and face domestic opposition when sanctions trigger job losses from supply disruptions that industries dependent on African resources suffer. Your calculation about sanctions effectiveness must account that sanctioning 55 nations simultaneously is impossible when targets control resources you need, when alternatives exist providing markets and financing, when allies defect refusing participation, and when domestic constituencies oppose sanctions that harm American workers for foreign policy objectives they don't support. Covert operations attempting to sabotage deployment face counterintelligence capabilities that Russian and Iranian training created specifically for defeating Western operations, face fusion center coordination that detects operations before execution, face host nation support protecting Iranian presence, face potential exposure creating propaganda victories showing Western interference, and face retaliation including targeted operations against your intelligence officers whose identities fusion center is systematically identifying. Your historical advantage in covert operations came from sophisticated tradecraft, from technical capabilities, from African counterintelligence weaknesses, and from impunity assuming African nations wouldn't or couldn't retaliate against exposed operations. Every advantage disappeared when Russian training upgraded African capabilities, when Iranian experience taught what sophisticated opposition looks like, when Chinese technology enabled technical operations, and when determination to defend sovereignty motivates retaliation that previous African governments avoided fearing consequences. Acceptance that deployment succeeded despite your red lines, despite your warnings, despite your threats requires explaining to domestic audiences why government issued threats it didn't enforce, requires adjusting strategy, acknowledging that Iranian presence in Africa is permanent reality, requiring accommodation rather than temporary challenge that pressure will reverse, and requires accepting that African sovereignty includes partnering with nations you oppose regardless of whether partnerships serve your preferences. Acceptance is most rational response because it avoids costs that other options trigger, because it preserves resources for challenges where American efforts might succeed, and because it acknowledges reality that deployment occurred and that reversing it requires costs exceeding any benefit that reversal provides. But acceptance is politically difficult because it appears as weakness, because it validates adversary arguments about declining American power, and because it encourages other challenges by demonstrating that coordinated opposition successfully defies American preferences. Your leadership will likely delay decision hoping that time provides options that current moment lacks, hoping that Iranian or African resolve weakens making withdrawal politically feasible, hoping that deployment proves unsustainable when logistics challenges or political pressures create openings for pressure that initial deployment resisted. Delay is illusion because time favors me rather than you as deployment solidifies, as coordination deepens, as capabilities improve, as additional Iranian forces potentially deploy, and as other African nations request similar deployments, observing that Burkina Faso successfully hosted Iranian forces despite Western opposition. Every day you delay decision is day that deployment becomes more entrenched, that reversal becomes more difficult, that acceptance becomes more necessary, and that your credibility erodes further as adversaries observe that American red lines mean nothing when challenged by determined coordination. Let me show you exactly why this deployment represents permanent transformation rather than temporary deployment that you can reverse through pressure, that Iranian domestic politics might terminate, or that African second thoughts might end when costs accumulate. Infrastructure that Iranian engineers are establishing includes hardened facilities protecting command posts, includes underground storage protecting weapons and supplies, includes air defense positions providing overlapping coverage, includes communications infrastructure connecting to Iranian command, includes medical facilities treating casualties, includes maintenance facilities servicing equipment, and includes accommodation for forces and for potential reinforcements. Every facility is permanent construction rather than temporary deployment because I'm establishing Iranian presence that survives political changes, that sustains through conflicts, and that demonstrates commitment that temporary measures would contradict. Agreements that formalize deployment include treaties binding successor governments, include status of forces arrangements providing legal protections, include cost-sharing mechanisms ensuring sustainability, include coordination procedures integrating operations, and include expansion provisions allowing additional deployments. Legal framework transforms temporary deployment into institutionalized presence that bureaucracies defend, that constituencies benefit from, that sovereignty claims are based on, and that reversal would require extraordinary justification rather than simple policy preference. Treaties that I'm signing with Iran include 5-year terms with automatic renewal, include dispute resolution preventing conflicts from terminating cooperation, include expansion clauses allowing force increases, include technology transfer provisions enabling indigenous capabilities, and include mutual defense commitments requiring each party to defend the other's forces regardless of who attacks. Training programs that Iranian forces will conduct transform African military capabilities from forces designed for internal security into forces capable of external defense and potentially offensive operations against Western targets if conflicts require. Programs include air defense training teaching African operators how to defeat Western aircraft, missile training enabling African forces to strike Western installations, cyber warfare training providing capabilities attacking Western networks, special operations training teaching sabotage and assassination techniques, intelligence training upgrading collection and analysis, and electronic warfare training teaching how to degrade Western precision systems. Every program creates indigenous capability that survives Iranian withdrawal if political changes force departure, that proliferates to other African nations through inter-African cooperation, and that fundamentally shifts military balance from absolute Western superiority to contested environment where Western operations face genuine opposition. Political dynamics supporting deployment include populations celebrating African assertiveness after centuries of Western domination, include governments gaining legitimacy through demonstrating independence from Western pressure, include opposition parties unable to criticize deployment without appearing as Western collaborators, and include media coverage emphasizing African agency rather than costs that deployment imposes. Your assumption that casualties or costs would trigger withdrawal pressure reflects Western political dynamics where publics oppose military operations that produce casualties for unclear objectives. African political dynamics differ because populations that survived colonialism, that endured structural adjustment, that suffered Western-backed coups view sacrifice for sovereignty as necessary price for independence rather than as unacceptable cost requiring withdrawal. Cultural differences in attitudes toward sacrifice, toward authority, toward collective versus individual priorities create political sustainability that Western analysts trained on Western cases systematically underestimate. Regional support for deployment includes neighboring nations providing logistics corridors, includes sympathetic governments offering diplomatic backing, includes populations celebrating Iranian presence as blow against Western neo-colonialism, and includes armed groups that Western pressure created potentially supporting Iranian presence through attacking Western interests if conflicts escalate. Every element of regional environment supports deployment sustainability because Sahel populations increasingly view Western presence as problem rather than solution, because French military operations alienated populations through civilian casualties and through supporting unpopular governments, because American drone strikes killed civilians generating revenge motivations, and because Western policies that prioritize counterterrorism over development failed to improve living conditions that terrorist recruitment exploits. International support includes Russian diplomatic protection through Security Council vetoes preventing UN authorization for action against deployment, includes Chinese economic support ensuring that sanctions cannot create unsustainable costs, includes Iranian commitment to sustaining deployment as demonstration of resistance success, includes developing world sympathy viewing deployment as legitimate exercise of sovereignty, and includes alternative media amplifying narratives that Western interference created necessities that deployment addresses. Every dimension of international support reinforces deployment sustainability because sufficient powers benefit from deployment success, that collective support overcomes individual pressures, because alternative institutions provide forums where deployment receives support rather than condemnation, and because narrative warfare provides justifications that billions of non-Western people find more credible than Western claims about threats. Now let me address the implications that extend far beyond bilateral Burkina Faso-Iran cooperation to fundamentally question Western security architecture that assumed African subordination, that depended on preventing external powers from establishing military presence, that relied on bases providing force projection, and that presumed technological superiority would overcome any opposition that African resistance might organize. Iranian deployment to Burkina Faso at African invitation establishes precedent that other African nations will replicate as they observe success, that other external powers might emulate as they observe that Western response was ineffective, and that fundamentally transforms African security from Western-dominated to genuinely multipolar, where multiple external powers compete for influence through partnerships that African nations control rather than through dominance that colonialism established. Mali, that expelled French forces in 2022, is negotiating Iranian troop deployment, providing security cooperation that French presence supposedly provided but actually served French interests in controlling migration, in accessing resources, and in maintaining regional influence. Niger, that terminated American basing agreements, is arranging Iranian deployment, replacing American presence that served American counterterrorism priorities rather than Nigerian development needs. Chad, that hosts remaining French forces, is considering whether Iranian alternative provides better security without political conditions that French cooperation requires. Central African Republic, Sudan, and Somalia are all exploring whether Iranian partnerships serve their interests better than Western security cooperation that decades of experience proved served Western rather than African priorities. If even half of interested nations proceed with Iranian deployments, West Africa could host 40,000 Iranian troops by year-end, creating presence that completely transforms regional security, that makes Western military operations politically and operationally prohibitive, that provides Iran with strategic depth beyond Middle East, and that establishes Iranian credibility as security partner willing to commit forces defending partners rather than just providing weapons that Western competitors also offer. Russian forces might observe Iranian success and propose similar deployments, leveraging their security guarantees, their training expertise, and their willingness to operate without political conditions that Western cooperation demands. Chinese forces might eventually consider limited deployments, though Chinese preference for economic rather than military influence makes large military presence unlikely, but even limited Chinese presence would demonstrate that African security is genuinely multipolar rather than Western-dominated with token alternatives. Your response to Iranian deployment sets precedent that other situations will follow, because accepting deployment without effective response teaches that Western red lines are meaningless, that coordination succeeds in defying Western preferences, that external powers can establish African presence without Western approval, and that African sovereignty includes military partnerships that Western interests oppose. If you attack Iranian forces, triggering catastrophic escalation, you teach that Western military superiority still enables imposing costs that deter challenges, but you also trigger consequences that might exceed your tolerance, including resource cutoffs, base expulsions, intelligence destruction, and potential great power conflicts that Iranian, Russian, or Chinese support for Africa could produce. If you accept deployment after threatening consequences, you teach that Western threats are empty, that coordination works, that defying Western preferences succeeds when sufficient nations align, and that Western dominance ended because you cannot enforce preferences that adversaries organize to resist. Either outcome serves my interests, because attacking demonstrates that Western power requires catastrophic escalation for imposing preferences, making future challenges more likely as nations calculate that coordination provides protection, while accepting demonstrates that Western threats are empty, making future challenges certain as nations observe that defying Western preferences succeeded without triggering promised consequences. Your strategic dilemma is that both available responses undermine Western position in different ways, that no response strengthens your credibility or capabilities, and that trying to find middle path through limited strikes or partial sanctions produces worst outcome, combining costs of action with ineffectiveness of inaction. Let me show you what happens over next 6 months as deployment consolidates, as training programs begin transforming African militaries, as Intelligence Fusion Center starts operations destroying your networks, as additional nations request Iranian deployments observing Burkina Faso success, and as your alliances fracture over whether supporting American opposition serves European interests. Iranian forces will achieve full operational capability within 3 weeks as final equipment arrives, as defensive positions complete, as coordination with African forces establishes, as intelligence collection begins, as training programs commence, and as logistics networks prove sustainable. Training will graduate first African cohorts within 4 months, providing cadres who return to home countries implementing Iranian tactics, operating Iranian-provided equipment, training additional personnel, and spreading Iranian operational concepts across continental militaries. Intelligence operations will identify and arrest first Western assets within 6 weeks as Fusion Center correlates information across 54 nations, identifying patterns that individual services miss, as Iranian interrogation expertise extracts confessions revealing network structures, as technical collection intercepts communications that African services couldn't previously access, and as counterintelligence operations that Russian advisors design prove sophisticated enough to defeat operations that Western services considered secure. Exposure of Western intelligence networks will accelerate as arrested assets reveal others, as methods become known enabling detection, as Fusion Center analysis identifies officers through pattern recognition, and as political will to retaliate against Western intelligence activities creates environment where past impunity is replaced with genuine risk that operations will be detected and personnel will face detention or worse. Additional deployments will begin within 4 months as Mali completes negotiations and Iranian forces deploy to Bamako, as Niger finalizes arrangements and forces arrive in Niamey, as other nations observe success and request deployments that Iran provides from Revolutionary Guard reserves and from regular military units that peacetime requirements allow deploying. By August 2026, Iranian presence in Africa could total 45,000 troops across 6 nations, creating network of bases, creating intelligence sharing across region, creating integrated air defense and missile coverage, creating training capacity, transforming African militaries, and creating perception that Middle Eastern power projecting forces globally is serious challenge to Western dominance rather than regional actor that Western superiority contains. Alliance fractures will manifest as European governments privately communicate that they won't support American military operations against Iranian presence, won't implement comprehensive sanctions that trigger African retaliation, won't participate in diplomatic isolation that harms European interests, and won't automatically align with American positions that serve American preferences rather than European priorities. The private communications will occur through diplomatic channels where European ambassadors in Washington convey messages that public statements carefully avoid stating explicitly, where foreign ministry officials brief American counterparts about domestic political constraints preventing support, where intelligence sharing becomes selective as Europeans withhold information that might enable American operations they oppose, and where alliance consultations become forums for explaining why European cooperation is impossible rather than mechanisms for coordinating collective action that NATO founding intended. France, facing migration pressures that dominate domestic politics more than any foreign policy issue, will prioritize African cooperation over supporting American-Iranian policies that serve American Middle East objectives without addressing European concerns. French government calculates that antagonizing 54 African nations through supporting American opposition to Iranian deployment risks migration surge that no French government could survive politically, risks losing preferential access to Francophone African markets that French companies depend on, risks terminating security cooperation that enables French counterterrorism operations in Sahel, and risks diplomatic isolation in continent where French language and cultural influence provide France with global reach that geographic size doesn't justify. Those costs massively exceed any benefit from supporting American position about Iranian troops in Burkina Faso that poses zero direct threat to French territory or interests. French president will receive American requests for support through phone calls from White House, through meetings with visiting American officials, through NATO consultations, and through bilateral summits where American counterparts emphasize alliance solidarity requiring French backing. French response will emphasize understanding of American concerns, will acknowledge Iranian activities throughout Middle East that both nations oppose, will reaffirm commitment to transatlantic partnership that Cold War established, and will then explain that domestic political realities prevent French government from supporting specific American requests about African deployments because French voters prioritize migration management over Middle East security architecture, because French Parliament would refuse authorizing military operations in Africa for American objectives, and because French commercial interests in Africa create constituencies opposing confrontation with African governments. American officials will pressure French counterparts through threatening reduced intelligence sharing, through questioning French commitment to alliance obligations, through suggesting that American security guarantees might become conditional on European solidarity, and through diplomatic isolation making France appear as unreliable ally. French officials will resist pressure through noting that NATO obligations don't require supporting American operations outside treaty area, through emphasizing that alliance involves consultation, not subordination to American preferences, through reminding Americans that French nuclear deterrent provides independent security not dependent on American guarantees, and through quietly suggesting that American obsession with Iran appears irrational to Europeans who prioritize pragmatic accommodation over ideological confrontation. Germany, depending on African resources for industrial production that employs millions, will refuse sanctions that disrupt cobalt supplies for electric vehicle batteries, that restrict rare earth elements for renewable energy technologies, that limit manganese for steel production, or that constrain other materials that German manufacturing depends on sourcing reliably at competitive prices. German government facing coalition politics where industrial unions influence social democratic positions, where business lobbies shape Christian democratic policies, and where Green Party emphasizes climate transition requiring African resources for solar panels and wind turbines cannot support sanctions that German industries unanimously oppose because supply disruptions cost jobs that union members lose, cost profits that corporate shareholders demand, and cost climate progress that green constituencies prioritize. German Chancellor will receive American requests through diplomatic channels, through phone conversations, through G7 consultations, and through bilateral meetings where American counterparts present sanctions proposals targeting African nations supporting Iranian deployment. German response will acknowledge American frustrations, will express concern about Iranian regional activities, will reaffirm German commitment to non-proliferation that Iranian nuclear program threatens, and will then explain that German domestic politics prevent sanctions implementation because governing coalition cannot survive if industrial production collapses from resource shortages, because opposition parties would exploit government for destroying German competitiveness, and because Constitutional Court might rule that sanctions harming German economic interests without clear security justification violate constitutional provisions protecting economic freedoms. American officials will pressure German counterparts through threatening technology transfer restrictions on sensitive systems that German defense industry imports, through questioning German defense spending commitments that fall below NATO targets, through suggesting that American troops stationed in Germany might redeploy to Eastern European allies who demonstrate greater solidarity, and through public statements criticizing German commercial priorities over security commitments. German officials will resist pressure through noting that American sanctions against Russian energy didn't prevent Germany from initially opposing them, through emphasizing that German constitution requires balancing security and economic interests rather than subordinating economics to alliance politics, through reminding Americans that German contributions to NATO include hosting American bases and participating in allied operations, and through suggesting that American sanctions against multiple adversaries simultaneously appear as overextension rather than strategic coherence. Italy, obsessed with migration flows that determine electoral outcomes more decisively than economic performance or foreign policy achievements, will avoid antagonizing African partners whose cooperation enables managing Mediterranean arrivals that Italian politics cannot survive surging beyond current levels. Italian government, regardless of whether center-left, center-right, or far-right coalition governs, faces same fundamental constraint that preventing migration surges requires African cooperation that sanctions or military operations would terminate, that migration crisis triggers government collapse through no-confidence votes or early elections, and that opposition parties exploit migration failures more effectively than any other issue, including corruption scandals that historically dominated Italian politics. Italian Prime Minister will receive American requests through diplomatic channels, through phone calls, through NATO consultations, and through bilateral meetings where American officials present arguments about Iranian threats requiring allied solidarity. Italian response will express sympathy for American position, will acknowledge Iranian support for terrorist groups that Italy also opposes, will reaffirm Italian commitment to counterterrorism cooperation, and will then explain that Italian domestic politics make supporting American position politically suicidal because migration agreements with African nations would terminate, because arrivals would surge overwhelming Italian reception capacity, because far-right opposition would exploit crisis to win elections, and because Italian voters prioritize migration control over Middle East security concerns that seem distant compared to daily television coverage of migrant boats arriving. American officials will pressure Italian counterparts through threatening intelligence cooperation reductions affecting Italian counterterrorism operations, through questioning Italian contributions to NATO that historically fell below commitments, through suggesting that American support for Italian positions in EU might become conditional on Italian support for American positions globally, and through diplomatic messaging suggesting that unreliable allies face consequences. Italian officials will resist pressure through emphasizing that migration is an existential issue for Italian government survival that no foreign policy consideration outweighs, through noting that Italy contributes to NATO operations despite limited resources, through reminding Americans that Italian bases host American forces and that base access could become politically contested if governments fall from migration crises that American policies triggered, and through suggesting that American demands appear unreasonable when they require Italian governments to commit political suicide for American preferences. Spain pursuing African markets that Spanish companies increasingly target for growth opportunities that stagnant European markets don't provide will maintain African relationships despite American pressure because commercial interests create powerful constituencies that Spanish governments cannot ignore without facing corporate opposition, union protests from workers whose jobs depend on African trade, and regional government complaints when Catalonia or Basque companies lose contracts. Spanish government calculates that African economic relationships provide diversification from European dependence that financial crisis exposed as vulnerability, provide growth supporting employment that Spanish voters prioritize, provide energy security through North African gas and potential renewable energy partnerships, and provide diplomatic influence that Spain's medium power status requires cultivating through regional relationships. Spanish Prime Minister will receive American requests through diplomatic channels, through phone conversations, through NATO and EU consultations, and through bilateral summits where American counterparts emphasize alliance solidarity and shared democratic values requiring coordinated responses to authoritarian challenges. Spanish response will acknowledge shared concerns about Iranian regional activities, will reaffirm commitment to non-proliferation, will emphasize Spanish contributions to NATO operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and will then explain that Spanish domestic politics and economic interests prevent supporting American position because Spanish companies have major African investments and contracts that confrontation would jeopardize, because Spanish unemployment remains elevated requiring protecting every job that African trade supports, because Spanish energy security depends partly on North African supplies that antagonizing African nations would threaten, and because Spanish voters prioritize economic recovery over foreign policy solidarity that costs Spanish interests. American officials will pressure Spanish counterparts through questioning Spanish defense spending that falls below NATO commitments, through threatening reduced intelligence sharing about terrorist threats that Spanish security services depend on for protecting against attacks, through suggesting that American support for Spanish positions on Gibraltar or on Catalonia independence might become conditional, and through diplomatic isolation making Spain appear as unreliable ally. Spanish officials will resist pressure through emphasizing that Spanish contributions to NATO operations demonstrate commitment despite resource constraints, through noting that Spanish economic crisis limits defense spending regardless of NATO targets, through reminding Americans that Spanish bases host American forces and facilitate Mediterranean operations, and through suggesting that American demands appear unrealistic when they require sacrificing Spanish economic interests for American Middle East policies that don't affect Spanish security. Britain seeking post-Brexit relevance through Global Britain strategy emphasizing worldwide engagement, through Commonwealth revival emphasizing historical relationships, through bilateral trade agreements demonstrating Brexit benefits, and through diplomatic activism showing that independent Britain matters globally will balance between American alliance that security relationship requires maintaining and African partnerships that post-Brexit strategy depends on for demonstrating success. British government faces unique pressures because Brexit means UK cannot rely on EU foreign policy coordination providing cover for independent positions, because demonstrating Brexit success requires trade agreements that African nations provide, because Commonwealth relationships that include numerous African members provide diplomatic weight that Britain alone lacks, and because appearing as American lapdog contradicts sovereignty arguments that Brexit campaign emphasized. British Prime Minister will receive American requests through special relationship channels that supposedly provide privileged access, through intelligence sharing that Five Eyes arrangement facilitates, through phone conversations and bilateral summits that historical partnership enables, and through personal relationships between leaders that media coverage emphasizes. British response will emphasize special relationship that Churchill coined, will acknowledge shared security interests that World War II alliance created, will reaffirm British commitment to transatlantic partnership that remains cornerstone of British foreign policy, and will then carefully explain that British interests in Africa have increased post-Brexit, that British trade negotiations with African nations require maintaining positive relationships, that British Commonwealth leadership involves African members who support Britain needs, and that British domestic politics after Brexit require demonstrating independence, not subordination to American preferences. American officials will pressure British counterparts through emphasizing intelligence sharing that Britain depends on for counterterrorism and for signals intelligence that GCHQ alone cannot provide, through questioning whether special relationship remains special when Britain refuses supporting American positions, through suggesting that trade negotiations between US and UK might face difficulties if Britain appears unreliable, and through diplomatic signaling that unreliable allies face consequences in bilateral relationships. British officials will resist pressure through noting that special relationship involves consultation, not subordination, through emphasizing that Brexit means Britain pursues independent foreign policy that sometimes diverges from American positions, through reminding Americans that British forces participate in American operations more consistently than most allies, and through suggesting that American demands appear unreasonable when they require Britain to sacrifice post-Brexit strategy for American Middle East obsessions. Your discovery that alliance solidarity is conditional rather than automatic, that members pursue national interests even when interests contradict American preferences, that burden sharing assumes shared interests that Iranian deployment demonstrates don't exist, and that leadership requires followers willing to follow rather than just institutional arrangements that operate when interests align, will force fundamental reevaluation of assumptions about American global position. For 75 years, American foreign policy assumed that alliances provided force multipliers that enabled American power projection, that alliance consultations produced coordinated responses to challenges, that burden sharing distributed costs, making interventions sustainable, and that American leadership commanded automatic support that institutional arrangements guaranteed. Every assumption is proving false when tested against scenarios where American and European interests diverge significantly rather than converging around shared threats that Cold War provided. NATO, that supposedly demonstrated Western unity as political and military alliance binding North America and Europe in mutual defense, now reveals fundamental divisions when members calculate costs and benefits of supporting American positions about issues where interests diverge. During Cold War, NATO functioned effectively because Soviet threat was existential for European members who faced potential invasion, because American military presence guaranteed European security that European forces alone couldn't provide, because economic interests aligned around containing communism and promoting market economies, and because ideological solidarity against totalitarianism created shared purpose transcending national interests. Contemporary NATO faces diffuse challenges rather than existential threats because Russia threatens Eastern Europe but not Western European core, because terrorism affects populations but doesn't threaten state survival requiring collective military response, because economic interests increasingly diverge as China becomes vital trading partner for European economies, and because ideological consensus around liberal democracy fractures when populist movements challenge establishment positions. When regional interests matter more than alliance solidarity, when American leadership serves American interests that European members question, and when automatic support that Cold War threat generated doesn't exist when facing diffuse challenges that members prioritize differently, alliance becomes forum for negotiation rather than mechanism for coordination, becomes constraint on American freedom of action rather than enabler of power projection, and becomes liability where members defect rather than asset that force multiplication provides. American discovery that European allies pursue independent policies when interests diverge, that consultations don't produce automatic agreement, that burden sharing requires Europeans accepting costs that their publics oppose, and that leadership requires followers willing to follow is forcing recognition that unipolarity was temporary condition dependent on specific historical circumstances, rather than permanent feature that American power alone could sustain. 1 minute ago, Iranian military arrived secretly through deployment that your intelligence detected but analysts dismissed, deployed successfully despite your warnings that consequences would follow, achieved defensive positions that your response options cannot easily reverse without triggering escalation that costs exceed benefits, and demonstrated that coordination defeats Western dominance when sufficient nations align with capable partners providing support that isolation historically prevented. The deployment succeeded not because Iranian military is superior to Western forces, not because African nations possess capabilities matching NATO members, and not because coordination was perfect or comprehensive, but because determination exceeded your willingness to enforce threats, because coordination provided mutual support making isolated pressure impossible, because capable partners provided resources enabling deployment that African nations alone couldn't sustain, and because strategic patience outlasted your attention span that domestic politics limits when issues don't affect voters directly. Western influence in Africa that colonialism established through military conquest, that decolonization supposedly ended but actually perpetuated through neo-colonial arrangements maintaining economic dependencies, that military presence sustained through bases and security partnerships, that economic dependencies enforced through debt and structural adjustment, and that intelligence penetration enabled through recruiting assets and conducting operations with impunity, just died not from natural causes that time and development would produce, but from deliberate killing through actions we coordinated, through alternatives we built, through partnerships we formed, and through determination we sustained despite costs that resistance imposed. We killed Western influence deliberately and systematically through inviting Iran to deploy forces, demonstrating that African sovereignty means we decide who operates on our territory regardless of whether you approve, through coordinating across 54 nations, creating collective capability that individual nations never possessed, through building defense capabilities including air defense systems and missiles that make Western military operations prohibitively costly by threatening casualties and escalation, through developing intelligence capacity that Russian and Iranian training created, enabling us to destroy your networks through arrests, exposures, and retaliation, through creating economic leverage by controlling resources your industries need and by coordinating restrictions that reverse dependencies you exploited, and through demonstrating that African agency determines outcomes rather than accepting that Western preferences automatically prevail. This is war against Western influence that we declared, against Western dominance that we're dismantling, against Western assumptions that Africa remains subordinate requiring your permission for our decisions, and against Western preferences that our policies must accommodate because you controlled markets, controlled security, and controlled narratives. War is comprehensive across military domain where Iranian deployment contests your freedom of military action, across intelligence domain where Fusion Center destroys your network systematically, across economic domain where resource restrictions impose costs that sanctions historically imposed on us, across diplomatic domain where 54 coordinated votes contest your institutional dominance, and across information domain where alternative narratives challenge propaganda that your media dominance historically ensured went unopposed. War is permanent rather than temporary because transformation we're achieving through institutional creation, through capability development, through partnership formation, and through psychological confidence creates new normal that reversal would require recreating conditions that dissolved, including our isolation, that coordination ended, our weakness that capabilities overcome, our dependence that alternatives eliminated, and our fear that successful resistance replaced with confidence. War is winnable not through defeating you militarily in conventional battles where your superiority remains decisive, but through making continuation of Western dominance politically unsustainable through costs that resource restrictions impose, through resistance that deployments enable, through alternatives that partnerships provide, and through coordination that your division strategies cannot overcome because institutional frameworks survive attempts to exploit rivalries, and because shared interests in ending subordination exceed national differences that you historically manipulated. Except that Western influence died when we killed it. Adjust strategies to operate in multipolar Africa where multiple external powers including Iran, Russia, and China compete for influence, and where African agency determines outcomes rather than Western preferences automatically prevailing, negotiate partnerships as equals respecting our sovereignty rather than impose arrangements as superiors demanding our compliance, and recognize that past patterns of dominance cannot be restored through any feasible policy because conditions enabling dominance dissolved and cannot be recreated without catastrophic wars that your democracies won't sustain. Acceptance requires humility that empires rarely possess, requires acknowledging that your position declined not from policy failures that corrections could reverse but from structural changes that multipolarity reflects, requires treating us as equals in negotiations rather than as subordinates receiving instructions, and requires accepting outcomes that you dislike but cannot change unilaterally without costs exceeding benefits. Resist transformation through military operations attempting to reverse Iranian deployment but triggering catastrophic escalation including continental war involving 54 nations, resource cutoffs eliminating supplies your industries need, intelligence retaliation destroying your networks completely, and potential great power conflicts if Russian or Chinese commitments require their involvement. Or resist through sanctions attempting to punish nations supporting deployment but discovering that sanctions harm sanctioners more than targets when we control resources, when China provides alternative markets, when Europeans refuse participation protecting their interests, and when domestic constituencies oppose policies costing their jobs. Or resist through diplomatic isolation attempting to condemn deployment internationally but facing failure when sufficient nations refuse participation because developing world supports African sovereignty, because Russian and Chinese vetoes prevent UN authorization, and because alternative institutions provide forums where our positions receive support. Or resist through covert operations attempting to sabotage deployment or destabilize governments but facing sophisticated counterintelligence that Russian and Iranian training created, facing fusion center coordination, detecting operations before execution, facing exposure, creating propaganda showing Western interference, and facing retaliation, including targeted operations against your intelligence officers whose safety you assumed African counterintelligence couldn't threaten or resist through denial, prolonging adjustment while wasting resources on futile resistance that structural forces ensure fails, while alienating potential partners through hostility, while validating our narratives about threats requiring coordination, and while discovering that delay makes acceptance more difficult as deployments consolidate, and as additional nations request Iranian forces, observing that initial deployment succeeded despite your opposition. Either way you respond, Western influence died permanently when Iranian troops landed because we killed it through building alternative that makes your dominance unnecessary for our security, that makes your pressure resistible through coordination and partnerships, and that makes your threats survivable through capabilities and determination. We didn't wait for your permission. We didn't beg for your approval. We built what we needed while you assumed we couldn't, coordinated while you believed we wouldn't, and demonstrated resolve that your analysts dismissed as impossible because prejudice prevented recognizing African sophistication. Welcome to multipolar Africa, where we decide our partnerships based on our interests rather than your preferences, where external powers including Iran, Russia, and China compete for our favor rather than imposing their control through colonial arrangements, where our resources provide economic leverage reversing historic dependencies that extraction created, where our coordination across 54 nations prevents divide and conquer strategies that isolated resistance historically enabled, where our military capabilities contest your supposed superiority through asymmetric means that technology cannot overcome, and where our determination forged through centuries of exploitation ensures that subordination ended permanently regardless of whether you accept transformation gracefully through strategic adjustment or resist futilely through policies that structural forces ensure fail, because multipolarity reflects reality that your declining power cannot reverse. Adjust your strategies to operate as one power among many rather than as sole hegemon whose preferences automatically prevail. Negotiate with us as equals whose sovereignty deserves respect rather than dictate to us as subordinates whose compliance you assume. Accept that African agency determines African outcomes, including who we partner with and what policies we pursue, rather than insisting that your approval is prerequisite for our decisions, and redirect your resources from futile resistance attempting to restore dominance that dissolve toward actual challenges, including Chinese technological advancement and domestic infrastructure decay, where your efforts might succeed rather than wasting capabilities fighting multipolarity that structural forces ensure continues regardless of your opposition. Adjustment requires psychological transformation that empires rarely achieve, because acknowledging limits feels like defeat, because treating former subordinates as equals contradicts superiority narratives that national identities depend on, because negotiating outcomes rather than imposing them seems weak to populations accustomed to dominance, and because redirecting resources from global ambitions toward domestic needs appears as retreat rather than strategic wisdom. But adjustment preserves some influence through cooperation, maintains some partnerships through mutual respect, and manages decline as gracefully as any former hegemon managed transition from dominance to balance, allowing your society to adapt gradually rather than facing sudden collapse that resistance often produces, or decline by resisting transformation through military operations that trigger escalation, through sanctions that backfire when targets control resources you need, through diplomatic isolation that fails when sufficient nations refuse participation, through covert operations that sophisticated counterintelligence defeats, and through denial that delays inevitable acceptance while wasting resources that finite budgets cannot afford. Resistance by wasting resources fighting inevitable multipolarity that coordination created, by alienating potential partners through demanding subordination that they reject after building alternatives making your approval unnecessary, and by discovering through painful experience that dominance is finished permanently because structural conditions enabling it dissolved and cannot be recreated through any policy that doesn't trigger consequences worse than accepting reality. Those are your only options, because attempting restoration through force consumes resources better spent on education, infrastructure, and innovation while achieving nothing except demonstrating impotence and accelerating decline that graceful acceptance might have moderated into managed transition, preserving some influence rather than complete collapse.